Hi there, and welcome to a very special convocation, one that I'm sure you're going to remember for a long time, not necessarily because of the content, but because you're probably sitting in your dorm room or you're comfy at home in your jammies watching this thinking, I never thought I could get convocation credit watching a video from the comfort of my own laptop. So in keeping with the spirit of our sort of casual convo conversation, I decided to go ahead and record this convo at my house too. So I'm standing here in my dining room. You may hear some interesting sounds. I've got kids playing outside. I've got dogs wandering around who might bark from time to time. But I thought, this is a good time to record history, and this is exactly what we're doing. We are in our homes. So, again, welcome to my dining room. Hopefully this is interesting for you. So for today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that I do. Now, many of you probably know me or you've seen me on campus. If you don't, my name is Jenny Barker-Devine. I am a professor of history here at Illinois College, and I'm also chair of the Department of History, Philosophy, Political Science, and Religion. So, in addition to teaching, I also do a little bit of research. And something that I'm really interested in is women's history right here in Jacksonville during the 1800s. I have big questions about what happens in a community where you have a lot of educated women. In the mid-1800s, Jacksonville actually had 3 schools for women. Illinois College was only for men. Women didn't go to IC until 1903. So, women had 3 options. They had the Jacksonville Female Academy, which I'll talk to you about today. They had the Young Ladies Athenaeum, which was a private institution. And then they had the Illinois Women's College, and that is what became McMurry. Now, I do just want to take a moment to recognize McMurry and the fact that they will be closing after 174 years at the end of this semester, and that really is a sad thing, not only for the community of Jacksonville and all the alumni and everybody, the faculty and the staff who have supported that institution through the years. It really is unfortunate. But in the context of what we're talking about today, when McMurry was founded in the 1840s, they were actually on the cutting edge of women's education. Excuse me. Even more so than the Jacksonville Female Academy. They really pushed the envelope of what it meant to educate women at that time. And so we just want to give them a shout out. And we'll talk a little bit about them, but focus primarily, again, on the Jacksonville Female Academy. Now, there's a lot of different aspects of my research that I'm interested in. I'm looking at a whole variety of things here in Jacksonville, including literary societies, social groups, churches, and other things. But something that I've been particularly interested in is how the Jacksonville Female Academy got started. Because like I said, it was a sister school to IC. And so just to help us think about why local research about Jacksonville is interesting to us, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of women's education. So up until about 1800, most girls didn't go to school. They might learn reading and writing at home, or they might remain illiterate. But by and large, it was not seen as important for women to learn very much because they weren't going to go on into any professions. So most women focused their efforts on learning how to keep a house, which at that time was like weaving, soap making, things that we don't do today. So they were still highly skilled, even if they weren't highly educated. But around 1800, this started to change because you have democracy and people are very excited about this new nation. And people start thinking, we ought to educate women more so that they can also be good citizens. They can't vote, but they should still be able to carry on an intelligent conversation with their husbands and their children. So we have a lot of historians telling us that women's education was really important to democracy. And what I want to do as a historian is contribute a new part to the conversation about that, about why were women being educated. And I want to add geography to the mix. Okay, so a lot of historians have looked at women's education, but they haven't really paid attention to the place where the school is. So that's why Jacksonville can teach us something about how place matters, how a community matters. In the early 1800s, Illinois was considered the West. It was considered the frontier. Jacksonville was founded in 1845, and of course, you all know that Illinois College then was founded in 1829 by people from New England. There's a historian, Patricia Limerick, and she wrote, "The history of the West is a study of place undergoing conquest and never fully escaping its consequences." And the historiography of the frontier here in Illinois mostly emphasizes women as wives, as helpmeets on farms, as moms. But they don't really look at single women. They don't really look at teachers. They don't think about how women's schools in the 19th century, which were largely rural, which produced the teachers who taught the children of the country, both pushed boundaries and helped women pursue women's rights and feminism, while at the same time maintaining social and political boundaries. All right, so let's think a little bit about where Jacksonville is. Like I said, founded in 1825, and right away, Jacksonville didn't really have a lot going for it. We didn't have a river running through here. We were just the geographical center of Morgan County, and so they founded the town here and made us the county seat. So early people here decided that they would make commerce and education the center of the town's economy. So the town's boosters got together and they said, let's make Jacksonville the Athens of the West, right? And Athens, of course, being a center of education and learning and all of those exciting things. So we know, again, 1829, congregational ministers come on out from Yale and they found Illinois College. The first president of Illinois College was Edward Beecher, of the very famous Beecher family. You might have heard of his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the following year, in 1830, those same men decided that they wanted to found an equal school for women. So they would educate men at Illinois College, and they would provide women with an identical education at what they called the Jacksonville Female Academy. So we've got two schools by 1830. Over the next 30 years, Jacksonville continues on this trajectory, and by 1860, we have two more women's colleges that I mentioned earlier, the Illinois School for the Deaf, the Illinois School for the Visually Impaired, and the Illinois State Asylum for the Insane. And women played central roles in all of these things as reformers, as patrons, as students, as administrators, staff, as teachers, nurses, alumni, medical practitioners, and patients. Now, for the all-male schools, like IC, their mission was pretty clear. Like I said, Illinois was considered the frontier. And of course, people lived here. There were still Native Americans in the area in the 1830s. But the white people who settled here didn't really see it that way. They wanted to recreate Illinois just like the places that they had come from, so like New England or the Upper South and Kentucky and Virginia. And they said, we need a place where we can train our new generation of professionals, our doctors, lawyers, scientists, educators, ministers, and businessmen. For women's colleges, the mission wasn't so clear. Women were barred from lucrative professions. They could not seek lines of credit to start a business. They were denied access from the legal and the political processes, so they couldn't vote, they couldn't sue, they couldn't serve jury duty. They had very, very few rights. And so women really didn't have the means to eke out their fortune on the frontier. So why would women want an education? That's a question we're going to be looking at a little bit later. Furthermore, life on the frontier is really unstable. There's two historians who have looked at Central Illinois, Springfield and Jacksonville specifically. So it's John Mack Farragher and Don Doyle are those historians. And they found that frontier life was very, very unstable. So just to give you an idea of how unstable it was. In 1830, Jacksonville had a population of 446 people. It's not that big. But only 5% of those 446 people were over the age of 40. All right, so that means that's a really young population. Jacksonville was a very young town. So only 5% was over the age of 40. 40% of that population, so almost half of that 446, were under the age of 10. All right, so from that data, we can figure out that most of the people who lived here were young families with little kids, and there were kids running around everywhere. And the one thing that characterized all these groups is transience. All right, so they're moving around. They're coming to Jacksonville, staying for a year, and moving on, or staying for a few months and finding some other opportunity. It's really only a core group of citizens who stayed who became community leaders. But by and large, people are moving very, very rapidly. So mostly men are coming in, they're starting businesses, they're trying to make some money, they're buying up land, becoming farmers, all of those things. What could women do? Right? That's a good question. There were two professions that were open to women, and that's independent women. Women did work on farms and they worked in their family businesses. But if a woman wanted to work on her own, in her own job, she could be a teacher or a writer. And another one of these was particularly profitable. But female teachers, particularly in Jacksonville and on the frontier, mostly taught in informal settings, and they only did it for a few years, usually before they got married or their life circumstances changed somehow. So here's one example of a teacher in Jacksonville. This is Ellen Spencer. She was a young woman who, when she was about 20 years old, migrated from New York to Jacksonville with her family. She decided to make a little bit of extra money by opening a school. Now, I've tried to look for her in the census to figure out, well, where was she educated and where exactly was she from? And that information I can't find. But from the ad, we know that she was very broadly and liberally educated. We can look at the subjects that she is offering to teach the young people of Jacksonville. That includes orthography, or handwriting, which was really important. They didn't have typewriters back then. Okay, so you had to write clearly. So orthography, reading, writing, grammar, modern and ancient geography, maps, astronomy, history, rhetoric, and plain and ornamental needlework. So she's offering some very traditional women's arts like needlework, but she's also offering some liberal arts education. And you can see she's got some tuition there, and she is doing this not in her home, but in a building that she's renting from a Mr. Dennis. Now, she only taught for a few years. I can only find her in the records actually teaching for about 2 years, and then she disappears. However, at the end of her life, she was 95 years old when she passed away, and she left us a will. And so there's a couple of clues in there about why she might have stopped teaching. She never married, so she didn't get married. That's not what stopped her from teaching. In 1836, she actually purchased 180 acres of land right here in Morgan County. And according to the will, she lived off of the rent that she collected from the farmer who cultivated that land. So when she died, she was actually a very wealthy woman, and she left a lot of money to different organizations all throughout the city, as well as to family members. So teaching for her was one way to make a little bit of money, and maybe that's what she used to purchase the land. It's hard to say. But for most teachers, teaching was considered the sort of higher calling during the frontier period. They really weren't doing it for the money. They were doing it in terms of service and serving the community, not necessarily to get rich at it. Now, this is evident in the development of the Jacksonville Female Academy. Fanny Ellis is the one who really first envisioned this Jacksonville Female Academy. Now, I know several of you out there might live in Ellis Hall. We see a show of hands. Okay, well, I can't see you anyway because this is a recording, but some of you might live in Ellis Hall. Now, Ellis Hall was named for the Reverend John Ellis. John Ellis was a Presbyterian minister. He was a missionary, and he was actually the founder of Illinois College. He never taught here, but he raised the money, he put everything together, he got Sturtevant and Beecher to come on out to serve as the professors and the presidents. He put together a board of trustees. So John Ellis is really the one that we have to thank for our fine school. Now, his wife was Fanny Ellis, and she's a fascinating woman. She was born into a French-speaking family who owned land in Haiti. But her family had to flee from Haiti in 1804 because of the revolution there. Her parents died shortly thereafter, and she was educated at a French-speaking school in Philadelphia. After that, she decided to move west to live in a French-speaking community at Kaskaskia with her sister. At some point while there, and we don't exactly know why, she converted from being a Catholic to being a Protestant. It could be that she had already met and fallen in love with John Ellis. We don't know. But they met, they fell in love, they got married, and they moved up to Jacksonville where John worked on Illinois College, and he encouraged his wife to use her talents to start a school for young women. So in 1830, in her home, she opened it up to young women to come in, and here's the ad that's in the newspaper from September of 1830. You can see that she teaches French as well as elementary and higher branches. If you didn't have a place to stay in Jacksonville, you could live with them. You can see board and washing, so you could stay there with them. They also had a library, which was a big deal. Not a lot of people had books on the frontier. So Fanny Ellis decided to open this school. At the same time, her husband John started a board of trustees for what would become the Jacksonville Female Academy. The board of trustees put all of their energy into finding a new building, right? So get it out of the Ellis home and make it into a building. The people responsible for raising the money to start the Jacksonville Female Academy was a group called the Ladies Society for the Education of Females. Fast fact, this group is still around. They're one of the oldest women's groups in the nation. They're still giving scholarships to young women. It's absolutely phenomenal. But the Ladies Society for the Education of Females was created harnessing the power of women's networks. The membership list of the Ladies Society reads like a who's who of Frontier, Illinois. This includes author Christine Tilson and others, and together they raised thousands of dollars among friends in New England and the East to fund scholarships, buildings, teacher salaries, not just for the Jacksonville Female Academy, but for schools, women's schools all across the state. But as powerful as they might be, for as much as they were doing, patriarchal society imposed significant limitations on their activities. For example, when it came time to hire a principal for the Female Academy in 1832, it was the trustees who inquired with Mary Lyon of Massachusetts. She was a pioneering educator, then of Ipswich Female Academy, and then she later founded the first women's college, Mount Holyoke. And here she is. Here's Mary Lyon. And I want to think for a minute of why did they contact Mary Lyon? Because by then, Edward Beecher lived in Jacksonville. His sister Catherine had also started a couple of women's schools and was a nationally recognized educator. So why would they go with Mary Lyon, who's also nationally recognized, as opposed to Edward's sister? Most of my research just tells me that they just didn't get along. So maybe that's why. But during the colonial era, higher education for women consisted mostly of needlework, fine manners, and maybe a little bit of French language. But Mary Lyon and her partner, Zilpha Grant, resisted this model. They believed that women could undertake the same academic subjects as men: history, geography, algebra, and science. They further insisted that academies minimize their expense so that young women from rural and farm families with limited resources could attend. And they instilled in their students the idea of service, that they should get this education and they should go out and be teachers and serve the community. So Lyon had a very practical approach to education that was well suited to sending young women to the Illinois frontier. Out here, needlework and French were not practical, but having a good liberal arts education absolutely was. So how did they get in touch with Mary Lyon? How did they know her? Well, it was most likely this woman here on your left, okay, Abiah Chapin Hale. She was a member of the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females, and she was the principal at a female academy at Edwardsville, Illinois. And I believe that she encouraged the trustees to place their faith in Mary Lyon, because Chapin was a graduate of Ipswich. She knew Mary Lyon personally. She had moved from New England to Illinois on Lyon's recommendation in 1831. Abiah saw teaching as doing God's work, and she went west only at the encouragement of her teachers and her parents. In 1836, Chapin wrote to Mary Lyon that in just 5 years she had borne witness to the dramatic growth of female academies, which served a purpose on the frontier, to provide smaller settlements and towns with trained teachers. As for the Jacksonville Female Academy, in 1833, Mary Lyon promptly recommended 36-year-old Sarah Choate Crocker of Londonderry, New Hampshire. Lyon first met Sarah Crocker in 1824 when Crocker was 27 years old. She was an older woman at that point, but she was interested in education, so she went back to school. And Lyon was her teacher at the Adams Female Academy. Shortly thereafter, Lyon hired Sarah Crocker as a teacher at Ipswich, and Abiah Chapin Hale and Sarah Crocker would have known each other there. In 1829, Crocker took the helm of a brand new school in Boscawen, New Hampshire. But what's interesting is she really didn't fit Mary Lyon's ideal qualification for Western teachers. In 1833, Mary Lyon wrote a letter to Catherine Beecher, again, that's Edward's sister, and she wrote that her hope was not in women considerably advanced in age who expect to remain unmarried. It's in young ladies scarcely out of their teens whose souls are burning from some channel into which they can pour their benevolence, who will teach 2, 3, or 4 years and then marry. Okay, so Sarah Crocker was 36 years old by the time she was recommended to go out west and move to Jacksonville. So she doesn't really fit this model. But I think that Mary Lyon saw something in Sarah Crocker and believed that she would be a good leader in taking on a brand new school. She would have to first be part of building the actual building of the Female Academy, and she would have to develop the curriculum, a whole new curriculum for the Female Academy. And while Crocker was a student under Lyon's direction, she was likely privy to Lyon's plans to build the nation's first female college. Again, that's Mount Holyoke. Also, Crocker had worked for several years at the Boscawen School in Boscawen, New Hampshire. So she had a lot of good experience, and I think Lyon saw that in her. In a letter to another principal in Amherst, Massachusetts, Mary Lyon offered to send over any number of capable teachers that she had at Ipswich. And this is interesting. In this letter, she described Sarah Crocker as someone who is, quote, doing everything that is for the best most faithfully, but doing it rather coldly. So we get a look into Sarah Crocker's temperament, somebody who is not particularly cheerful, but who will do her duty. And so maybe this is why Mary Lyon chose her as someone who could handle the conditions on the Illinois frontier and deal with a bunch of congregational ministers at Illinois College. So in the spring of 1833, Sarah Crocker arrived in Illinois with her younger sister Elizabeth and a former pupil from the Ipswich Female Academy, Caroline Blood. Now this hints at a significant professional connection in her network. Blood was a recognized reformer and teacher who gained prominence in the 1820s, working with the Infant School Society of Boston. There, Caroline Blood managed what was basically a daycare, a preschool, that allowed moms to work. So it was kind of like a daycare at a time when daycare was unheard of. And here's an ad for both the Jacksonville Female Academy, and Caroline Blood has opened a daycare here in Jacksonville, Illinois. So the first of its kind here. So Sarah Crocker came on board. She became the first principal at the Female Academy and signed a contract that paid her the handsome sum of $300 per year. That's about half of what the male professors made at Illinois College. And she began living and teaching with Fanny Ellis while the building of the Jacksonville Female Academy was under construction. But unfortunately, within just a few weeks of her showing up in Jacksonville, there was a cholera epidemic here in Jacksonville. So Sarah Crocker could certainly relate to what we all are going through. She had plans. She was going to start the school. She was going to teach. And then suddenly an epidemic takes care of that. In her case, it was an extremely sad situation because Fanny Ellis, two of her children, and Fanny Ellis's niece all died within a 24-hour period of cholera. Sarah Crocker and her sister also got sick. They were taken in by the professors, Julian Sturdivant and Jonathan Baldwin Turner here at IC, and they eventually recovered. But nevertheless, it was an extremely serious situation. So that was the summer of 1833, and their plans for the school are curtailed. But by the end of that year, Blood has her infant school up and running, and both Caroline Blood and Sarah Crocker are members of the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females. Now, even if some women experience some personal empowerment as educators or benefactors, the trustees' dependence on the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females didn't necessarily level the gendered power dynamics in the wider community. At the second annual meeting of the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females in 1834, Secretary Caroline Wilder Baldwin imbued her audience with a sense of urgency when she estimated that approximately 1.4 million children in Illinois were, quote, destitute of common school instruction. This generated a demand for more than 40,000 new teachers, with an annual increase of 2,500 thereafter. So through the Ladies' Society for the Education of Female Network, they discovered dozens of single women working in small towns and villages to start their own female schools, and they continued to build these networks. Again, mirroring the words of the female reformers at the time, Baldwin used bold language to describe the Ladies' Society, noting that their Sorry, I've got a dog barking. I want you to be able to hear me. Okay. Caroline Baldwin said that their work through the Ladies' Society was a revolution that, quote, let us take possession and labor till we have a nation of educated mothers and qualified teachers, till the cloud of mental darkness which now hangs over us is rolled away, and the light of science and religion shines in unbroken splendor. Yet Baldwin, she's a pretty liberated woman. She's so brazen as to use her own name in public. Most women would go by like Mrs. Edward Beecher or Mrs. Jonathan whatever, I don't know. But she used her own name. She was Caroline in the wider public. But here's what's interesting. In that 1834 meeting, Caroline didn't actually speak. She did not read her speech. She wrote it. But Edward Beecher, the president of Illinois College, read it for her. Because women were not permitted to speak in public. Married women could not own property. They could not enter into legal contracts. They could not deal with financial matters. So the women of the Ladies' Society 100% depended on men to get all of their business done. And what's interesting is that the men, they didn't recoil at Caroline Baldwin's suggestion that they were on an eve of a revolution. In fact, they thought they were pretty radical. They thought they were pretty open, even as they held fast to what they thought of as appropriate gender roles. In 1834, Julian Sturdivant, who was our first professor and second president at IC, he was a forward-thinking 29-year-old who traveled to New England to speak on behalf of Illinois College, raise some money. And there he had the opportunity to meet Mary Lyon in person. They'd written a lot of letters to get Crocker out there, but they got to meet in person. And he described her as, quote, a remarkable woman whose thinking on education was fresh and suggestive, his words, not mine. And he expressed enthusiasm for Lyon's planned women's college, Mount Holyoke. But her one fault, Sturdivant said, was, quote, that in her earnestness with which they would pursue an argument when the conversation had become spirited and controversial, she led me to forget that I was conversing with a woman and tempted me to forget the courtesy ever due their sex. All right, I've still got some dogs barking. That's kind of how, quarantine convos go. I think it's okay. Hopefully you can still hear me over that. All right. So without a doubt, the trustees of the female academy, so the men overseeing the school, had very specific expectations for the teachers and the principals that they hired. So the following year, in 1835, just 2 years after they had arrived, all three women, Sarah Crocker, Elizabeth Crocker, and Caroline Blood, all followed Mary Lyon's prescription when they got married to prominent men in Jacksonville. And in doing that, they cemented their elite status as women in the community, and it provided them access to social circles that they never would have enjoyed back in New England. In fact, Crocker was well connected through her family, but she herself was not particularly wealthy. But now, she's married Elihu Wolcott, who is like one of the richest guys in town, and he's also the head of the Illinois Abolitionist Society. And this got her into all kinds of social circles. And we know this because one of her recipes for ginger snaps shows up in a cookbook that belonged to the governor's wife, Governor Joseph Duncan, who lived here in town. His wife, Elizabeth, had written down Mrs. E. Wolcott's ginger snaps. And we actually had an IC student, Rachel Helmick, transcribe that cookbook and use it as a fundraiser for the Duncan Mansion. It's pretty cool. There's some great recipes in there if you're hungry. All right. So Crocker used her influence to raise funds for the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females up through her death in 1842. And the trustees thought, we had such good luck with Crocker for 2 years, let's reach out to Mary Lyon again and her partner Zilphiah Grant to see if she can send us someone else. So in 1835, Sarah Crocker most likely played a role in securing a new principal named Emily Price. Now, Emily was Sarah's former student at Boscawen, and she was also a graduate of the Ipswich Female Academy. So this further hints at the ways in which women's migration depended on social networks, as well as a belief that migration was not for personal gain, but rather for this higher purpose, that women wanted to go out and serve their communities. So why would Emily take this job? We know that Sarah, she had some good experience. She was 36. She wasn't married. What did she have to lose, right? But what about Emily? What brings her from Boscawen? Well, I can't say for sure, but I think it was Emily's dad who encouraged her to come out to Jacksonville. Emily Price's father was the Reverend Ebenezer Price, and he's this handsome gentleman here on the left. He served at Boscawen's Congregational Church, and on August 22nd, 1822, when Emily was 13 years old, her father delivered a sermon titled Female Excellence. Now, it begins like a typical sermon of that time, highlighting the biblical story of Lydia. Lydia was a merchant who forsook a lucrative business in purple cloth to become a Christian. Now, as we might expect, Ebenezer Price highlighted women's pious nature, that they were more moral than men. But then he surprises us by highlighting women from the Bible whose virtue did not depend on motherhood. Now, that includes Lydia, right? Lydia was a merchant, and her story is in the book of Acts, if you'd like to look that up. And then Deborah, who is a female judge and a warrior from the book of Judges. He then exemplified female virtue in 3 contemporary women, so women who were alive in the 1800s at that time. So he talked about Hannah More, who was a playwright and a blue stocking, or a feminist. Back then they didn't have the word feminist. They called them blue stockings, okay? Then educator. So another woman educator, Isabella Graham. And then finally, G. Harriet Howell, who was a philanthropist. She had a lot of money, and she gave it away to good causes. And all three of these women, Hannah More, Isabella Graham, and G. Harriet Howell, were distinguished in the public realm for their good work. So thus far in my readings on female education, and there's a lot of ministers preaching about female education at this time, this is really unique. I have not seen anything else like this in my research. And let me tell you, I went to Boscawen, New Hampshire. Okay, this is a little out of the way place that you would never go unless you were like, hey, I'd like to learn about the history of Boscawen. And the people there were super nice, and they were really helpful. And they just had this little room full of files, and they pulled out this file, and they said, hey, here's Ebenezer Price. Read this sermon. And I did, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have never seen anything like this. So it was a complete surprise when I found it. So at the end of the sermon, Ebenezer Price says, all women, regardless of their station, no matter where they're from, no matter how much money they have, should work for the cause of Christ. Those are his words. So they should work for the cause of Christ. And in particular, women should leave behind, quote, their mothers, their sisters, and their native country, and go to the lands of darkness, where nothing is found to cheer life but the isolating hope that their Lord will make them humble instruments of doing something for the conversion of the world. So you can imagine little 13-year-old Emily in 1822 sitting in the audience going, I wonder if I will go to a land of darkness someday. And that she did. So while the family's kitchen table conversation is lost, we know that the Reverend Price was a very active reformer. In 1828, he was a founding trustee of the Boscawen Academy, which still stands today. Here we go. Here's a picture of it. Today, it serves as the Boscawen Historical Society. So this is where you find a lot of really cool old stuff. Reverend Price hired Sarah Crocker as the first principal there. And Crocker most likely lived with the Price family while she was the principal at the Boscawen Academy. Now, it wasn't just these social connections. By the 1830s, Boscawen, New Hampshire was suffering from some economic problems, and a lot of young residents migrated out of the city and went west, particularly to Illinois. So it could be that Emily wanted to be a teacher, or she wanted to get married, but there just weren't any other young people there. And why not go to a place where only 5% of the people are over the age of 40, right? There's going to be a lot of young eligible bachelors in Jacksonville. That is, if marriage is her calling. So within the Price household, we know that moving west as a single woman was considered a vocation. They thought of it as part of God's larger plan and well within the appropriate bounds for female behavior at that time. Now, like her predecessor, Emily Price got married after just 2 years in Jacksonville. And upon receiving her resignation, the Jacksonville Female Academy trustees passed a glowing resolution that praised Emily for, quote, the fidelity with which she charged her duties. At the same time, the trustees decided that the rapid turnover inherent to female leadership warranted a shift toward male principals. Just a few years later, when he founded the Monticello Female Academy in Godfrey, Illinois, and that's now Lewis and Clark Community College. So if you're ever driving through there and you see that really cool old stone building in Godfrey, that's the old Monticello Female Academy. Now Lewis and Clark. Okay, so Theron Baldwin, whose wife Caroline spoke in 1834 at the meeting of the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females, he founded the Monticello Female Academy. He wrote that female leadership was simply too unstable, and female schools, quote, should embrace in proper place and proportion the masculine element, while the main work of instruction should be in the hands of females. So Baldwin thought the principals need to be men, the teachers need to be women. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why didn't they just let married women teach? I would like to know that too. But at the time, it simply wasn't done. In fact, up until the 1970s, a lot of women were simply expected to quit working once they got married, or at the very least once they had kids. So it's not actually that far in our past that those types of social expectations were present, or even laws, right? On the other hand, under the leadership of Sarah Crocker and Emily Price, the Jacksonville Female Academy flourished and maintained high enrollments for the remainder of the century. Women enjoyed a broad liberal arts curriculum, as well as an extensive library and cultural events in town. By the mid-1840s, the Jacksonville Female Academy was back under female leadership, and thousands of young women benefited from the educational opportunities there. Alumni became involved in social movements, including suffrage and temperance. Several earned advanced degrees. And the academy itself, and that's this building here, unfortunately it's gone now. It's where the Jacksonville High School Bowl is, or the JHS Bowl is, down on College Avenue. But the academy itself became a fixture for cultural and educational events in the community. In 1856, a young man named Wallace Clement was a young clerk at a dry goods store, and he wrote a letter back home to his family in Vermont, where he said, "I see a great many young ladies every day. There are 3 female colleges here. The Methodist has 300 students," that'd be McMurray. The Berean, 50, and Presbyterian, that's the female academy, about the same. Some of them are quite good looking, others decidedly green and unsophisticated. I have 2 or 3 compliments from them. One said I had the handsomest eyes she ever saw. So now we're getting some insight into these young ladies at the Female Academy and how flirtatious they are. But also he writes about seeing them at social events and interacting with them in a whole variety of ways. Now, while it's tempting to hail the accomplishments of the Jacksonville Female Academy, I'm also drawn back to Patricia Limerick. She's a historian who I quoted at the beginning. And she asserted that we are still unpacking the consequences of conquest. County histories and reminiscences written late in the 19th century assert boldly that the Jacksonville Female Academy was the first institution of higher learning for women west of the Alleghenies. They say that its founders were bold women who defied patriarchy to make it so. Now, that's not true. The former is certainly untrue. The latter is complex and contested. Yet these narratives, these stories that we tell about these types of schools remain very powerful even in 2020. So the Jacksonville Female Academy closed in 1903 when integrated with Illinois College. But like I said earlier, the Ladies' Society for the Education of Females is still providing scholarships to female students, and that big heroic narrative is an important part of their ongoing mission. So if the Jacksonville Female Academy wasn't first, and if its women weren't exactly heroic, what's our takeaway? Why do we care? What do we gain from hearing the stories of people like Ellen Spencer, Fannie Ellis, Sarah Crocker, and Emily Price? Well, we learn that geography matters. First, the frontier Illinois was not an isolated, howling wilderness, as many of the people back then liked to describe it. The people here maintained firm connections in the East. Mary Lyon maintained correspondence with almost all of her former students, even going so far as to provide some, like Abaya Chapin, with small loans to help them build schools, to see themselves through an illness, or simply get settled in their new town. Second, female academies across the nation were largely rural, and the people they served demanded a practical education. Again, Mary Lyon met that demand by insisting that students replicate her instructional methods and her devotion to the liberal arts in the academies that they started. So again, Sarah Crocker was a good choice to come out here and to maintain that liberal arts mission of the Female Academy. Now there's another historian, Doris Malkmus, who noted that during this period, the students and teachers at female academies in the Mississippi River Valley shifted national debates about women's education toward academic training and equal opportunity. Before the Civil War, Illinois had more than 200 100 female academies. They were staffed by teachers who rejected older models of female education based on needlework and a little bit of French, maybe some dancing and some manners. And they said women need to learn how to be good citizens and educated members of society. This tells us that the women of Jacksonville, along with hundreds of teachers from New England, played a significant role in shaping the educational and intellectual tenor of the frontier as they trained the next generation of teachers working in emerging communities. So this is where I'm going to end, but I hope you have found this interesting. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to email me. It's just jenny.barker-devine@ic.edu. I'm happy to answer any and all of your questions. So here's where we part, and I hope you all stay well, that this video finds you safe and comfortable wherever you are. And I hope you know that if anything comes up in this crisis that you might need, we are here for you. Just reach out and we will help you figure out whatever it is that you need. All right, well, thank you for hanging in there for this very long convocation. Hope it was worth the credit. We'll see you later.